So let's now look at the book by Michael Anderson, Approaches to the History of the Western Family, 1500 to 1914. So this includes the period that we are going to focus mostly on, so the period until the outbreak of the First World War. So we'll talk about the 18th century and the long 19th century, so from the French Revolution to the outbreak of the First World War. And as Anderson states in the introduction, in the beginning of his book, family history as a field of study is a relatively recent subsection of history, because he believes it really starts in the second half of the 20th century, after the Second World War. Before, we have some elements of it integrated into history or historical biography, but it's quite limited. We'll talk about the limitations in a little moment, and it's not really systematic. So what Anderson believes to be the beginning of the modern study of family life is the groups of scholars, two groups basically working independently in the 1950s. One was in France and the other one was in Cambridge in England, and they started doing research not so much on family life but on population studies. So the first approach that he mentioned is called the demographic approach. Demography, as you hopefully know, is the study of human populations. It's not really interested in individual stories. It deals with large groups of people, entire nations or social classes, or at least inhabitants of some region or city, and it uses some specific sources as the base resource of study, and these are the demographic sources. So the easiest way to do it would be to use the censuses. And if you think about it, the first demographic censuses, in which you have the special researchers or kind of collectors of data going from one household to another, asking questions about all kinds of things, mostly about private life and living conditions, and also family and work and such things. They start in the 18th century. They start with the Enlightenment. This is the moment when governments of big European countries, mostly France, it first starts in France, start to notice how important for the economy of the country are the people. People are called even a kind of super resource that produces other resources. You cannot have a prosperous economy without a big population, without many people, especially before you have the mechanization, before you have the industrialization, which only starts very, very slowly to develop with the Industrial Revolution and later, let's say, in the Victorian period. But you still need a lot of people to work these machines, to deal with agriculture, to provide the military strength of the country. So the idea behind the first censuses is to see what makes the population grow. So what we have is those first censuses, but what happens before? How can we even think of of the demographic approach to family history before. There is a wonderful resource that has existed long before the censuses were ever conducted, and it actually still exists today, and it can be used as a valuable resource. And these are church books. The books that note down all the important ceremonies in a person's life, and especially if we look at the earlier epochs of the development of European civilization, the role of the Christian church or churches, first the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, was very important. Practically everyone was mentioned in those books. Each important occurrence in a person's life was marked by a special ceremony, a rite of passage. So after the birth, there was a christening or baptism. When a new family was being established, there was a marriage ceremony, a wedding. And when somebody died, there was a ceremonial funeral. So all these births, marriages and deaths were noted down in the books and chronicles of the churches. Usually, well, even at the parish level, so at the very local level, you have the parish books. And many people who are interested in compiling their own family tree, this is one of the first places they go to. The parish of residence of their family, where all these facts would be noted down. So we have quite a lot of information to be deduced from what looks like a very dry set of data. So what Anderson mentions is, for example, marriage rates and ages. How old were people when they married for the first time? What was the average age of marriage for men, for women? Did people marry once or many times? For example, if one spouse died, was remarriage of widows and widowers popular? Was divorce possible and remarriage after divorce? So we have all these marriage rates and ages. What percentage of people never married for whatever reason, but was it the same for men and women, or was it different? So we have all this sort of information to be deduced from just the marriage certificates. The patterns of childbearing, so the average number of children per family. Was it stable? Was it changing? Did many children die in childhood? So we have the baptisms, and then possibly we can have deaths of children, so we can get the information like how dangerous childhood was, how dangerous were all the diseases connected with childhood. Patterns of childbearing, so was it frequent for the first child to be conceived before the wedding? In some social groups, in some periods, this is actually the reason why people get married. So they wouldn't consider marriage unless the woman was pregnant. Was it a common occurrence or not? Did people have children spaced regularly in the years of the marriage corresponding to the fertile period? Or did they have most of the children in the beginning, in the first few years of marriage, and then they didn't have any more? Does it mean they stopped having sexual relations? We do not really know, but we can observe a pattern Illegitimacy, so extramarital conceptions. We have perhaps some children born to unwed mothers. Was it common? Was it something that was popular? With the censuses, we start having things like the size and membership of the household, how many people live under one roof, how they are related. Is it a nuclear family, so the parents and children living together, or the extended family, including some other relatives, or perhaps there are people who are not blood relatives at all and they still live together. So all these things can be deduced from this one approach, the demographic approach, from the censuses and parish books. Of course, there are some problems with this approach, and the voices of criticism were raised quite soon. So first of all, we do not have any interpretation. We are left to interpret the facts on our own. We do not really know, like, what were the attitudes, let's say, towards pregnant women getting married, or illegitimate children, or what were the emotional relations between people living under one roof. So, for example, we know there was a grandmother living with the family, but was she respected and loved and cherished, or everybody just waited for her to die? So we do not have any kind of human emotions. And on top of that, we have something that is called in the book the meaningless mean, or the French term, le mal de moyenne, because the French demographers observed it probably the first. So it's like this joke that you have a rider on a horse. The rider has 2 legs, the horse has 4 legs, so on average each of them has 3. Or there is a child that dies at birth, basically, soon after the birth, and then there is an old person who lives until they are 100. So on average, each of them lived for 50 years, which is not true in either case. So we have like this average that tells you absolutely nothing about individual cases. It can work on very, very large groups or large samples of the population, and can tell you something perhaps about like the general trends. Like nowadays everyone is talking about the fact that the European societies are getting older. So on average people live longer and they have less children than before. So the average age of a person living in the Western civilization is higher than it was, let's say, in the previous generations. But does it tell you anything about individual stories? Not at all. So there we go to the second approach mentioned in Anderson's book, and this one is called the sentiments approach. And this is something that probably predates the kind of scientific study of the Western family models, because this goes back to this, let's say, history and historical biography I mentioned earlier. Some of the scholars that we are going to rely upon this semester, especially Lawrence Stone, are listed in Anderson's book as kind of prime examples of the sentiments approach. So the sentiments approach is about human emotions. So all the things that are missing from this dry list of facts and figures provided by the demographic approach. So we have a lot of personal accounts. we have diaries, we have letters, we have all kinds of written sources, including literary fiction, especially in the realistic style. But not only poetry and even fantasy books, they tell a lot about the people who wrote them and the times when they were written. So we have all these written sources. We have a lot of material culture. So we have the houses from rich to poor, so any type of dwelling places that people lived in. We have all kinds of daily objects, kitchen utensils, furniture, toys for children, practically anything. And each object, of course, can be seen as a kind of emissary of the culture that produced it. It tells you a lot about the way people thought, the way people behaved on a daily basis. So if you look like things connected with clothing and meals and leisure activities, you have a lot of information to be deduced just from the objects. You have all kinds of works of art. So portraits and other paintings, sculpture, also things like tomb effigies. So the figures sculpted to decorate graves of people who died. It tells you a lot about the culture. It tells you about the feelings of the people who were putting up those statues. Did they mourn the deceased? Did they want to honor them? So all kinds of private, personal, sometimes even intimate sources pertaining to private life. So what we have is the things like the space within a household. So the division of space, the rooms. Was there a separate bedroom? Was there a separate study? Did people spend time together, or did they seek privacy? Did they want to have more privacy within the domestic circle? We have a lot of information about changing attitudes to interpersonal relationships. So the letters in which people talk about their feelings, their love life, the spouse selection, the expectations, the hopes and disappointments. We have a lot of such stuff. So we know, for example, how people chose their spouses. Was it a personal decision? What were the criteria? Was it something imposed on the young people by their families? What were the expectations and functions of marriage? Was it, for example, expected that the spouses would love each other? And what was meant by it? If we have letters and diaries and novels, we have a lot of such information. What were the attitudes towards sexuality? So, was virginity important? Was homosexual behavior tolerated? Was illegitimacy tolerated? What was the attitude towards unwed mothers? Did it depend on their social class or not? So we have all these things. The questions concerning parenthood and childhood. What were the relations between parents and children? How did they address each other? Did you say mother or mummy? There is a lot of difference here. Was the child supposed to be obedient or rather independent and kind of spunky? What were the expectations? What did it mean to be a good mother? What did it mean to be a good father? Does it change in time? Of course it does. So we have this whole idea of the sentiments approach. Again, you may want to think about the problems here. And the main problem is this is all geared towards the rich sections of the society. For the kings and aristocracy, later or earlier in the history, and then for the let's say middle and upper class later on. So the people who could afford good quality of things, so their clothes and their domestic objects were more likely to survive. People who lived in palaces, so they would not be destroyed like the small houses of the poor, especially in the country. People who were literate, so they were writing letters and diaries and other things. People who could sponsor artists to produce valuable and important works of art, so all those beautiful paintings and portraits and sculptures survive. So we have a lot of bias towards certain groups of the society, whereas other groups, like the poor people or the people living in rural environment, we know very little about their lives because not much of the material culture survives to modern times. Or perhaps if we include literature, how true is it to the times? Doesn't it just reflect personal opinions or even prejudice of the person who wrote it? The same in the letters and diaries. Did they say that? Did they tell the truth? Perhaps they lied. Perhaps they whitewashed their lives, or they wanted to make it more exciting, or they wanted to present themselves in a better light. So they didn't really tell the truth. Can we trust them? Can we trust these written sources? So we have all these questions really arising with regard to the sentiments approach. But then again, well, if you have a large selection of examples, you can perhaps come to conclusions about the trends and dominant models. The third approach in Anderson's book is called the household economics approach. And this is an attempt to link the family to a broader society, so to see the family unit as part of the society, especially the society in the capitalist form of economy. So members of the families dealing with the money. So for example, the employment, how people worked. Was it common for men and women to work? Did they earn the same amount of money? And if not, then what were the changes? Also, how the changes in the working patterns influenced the private life. Things like the industrialization and urbanization in the 19th century, how they were reflected in the private and family life. Also, what were the arrangements concerning inheritance? So, who got the money and the house and other things after a member of the family died? Was it the same in all social classes? Was it different for I don't know, the country people and the city people, or the aristocracy and the middle and working classes? So all these things can really contribute to our study of the history of the Western family. And in a moment, I will talk to you a little about the way that Lawrence Stone starts his book on the family, sex and marriage in England. So we continue in a moment.